that was gifted to me. I wish you could smell it. It smells really good. So, just prayers to center us and to bring us goodness and to call the Creator and the ancestors to us that they might favor us in this moment. So thanks, Megan, for allowing me to be a part and for gathering us all together in this circle today.
Yeah. I wish I had all my cedar incenses around here now. So good. I was imagining Joel Workin and Paul Brenner joining us when you were saying that.
Mm.
I've been thinking a lot about today. So today is 4 years since the Pulse nightclub shooting, and 49 people who were killed. And I've been thinking a lot about how we carry stories in our bodies, and some of those stories are good, and some of those stories are traumatic, and just how we carry those and remember them. And sometimes we're really good at remembering, and other times we need reminders. So yeah, thank you for that reminder, Vance.
Well, they're always with us, even if we at times as humans forget or get too busy. And that's the beauty for me. You know, we say that Christ is always with us, but for us, for me, I think for all of us, our ancestors are journeying right along with us as well. Just as Jesus, just as Christ is an ancestor of ours. So yeah, it's a beautiful gift when we do have those times to remember. And you know, we certainly have those moments of mourning and grieving, but there's also some celebration and comfort carrying them with us beyond the grieving and mourning.
I was listening to a podcast the other day that was talking about these two people were talking, and they expressed their pull to stand by the ocean lately since the pandemic has started. And they talked about connectedness and somehow standing at the edge of the ocean and contemplating the immensity of it made them feel small, which made the world's problems feel not so overwhelming, but it also made them feel like part of something bigger instead of the center of everything that must be. And what a relief that was. And as I was listening to you now, I think that's how I think of the communion of saints as well, of all of our ancestors and all the whole host that surrounds us. Like, thank God I'm not alone. Thank God I'm just one of many instead of the one who has to.
Yeah.
Yeah. For those who are joining us, we'll start at 2 o'clock. Joel Workin. I think this is the quietest a group of clergy And faith people have been in quite some time. Hey, Lenny.
Well, now Lenny's here, so it's going to get really loud.
Oh. Good to see you, Lenny.
Greetings, everyone.
What I'll do is I'll start us off at 2 o'clock with some logistics, like just letting people know about the webinar format. And then my video will go away, but I'll still be here. And then I'll work on collecting Q&As and things like that to help you get questions from the folk on Facebook and on the Zoom.
Cool.
I see folk are beginning to gather. We'll start at 2 o'clock. Thank you for joining us.
Holy shit, I just noticed this collection of people when I put it on gallery view. What a dope collection of people. Jesus.
It's true. It's true. It's like a queer collage. It's like when everyone was trying to do puzzle pieces, but it's people, right?
It's like when they summoned Captain Planet, what I hoped would come.
Yes.
Get to be fire.
All right. Well, I'm gonna start us off with some of the logistics for those who are watching here on the Zoom webinar. First of all, welcome to our town hall that seeks to prioritize voices of intersectional Lutherans, co-sponsored by Just Lutheran and the Racial and Ethnic Ministry Strategy Discipling Team of the Sierra Pacific Synod. I am Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I'll be sharing some information about logistics at the beginning of our meeting and collecting the Q&A questions for those joining us on Zoom or on Facebook Live. First of all, you might have noticed there are no video or microphone access for folk who are not a part of our panelists today. We're doing this intentionally to try to center the voices that we're listening to. It also helps to minimize the possibility that our Zoom space will be intentionally disrupted in harmful ways. For tonight's conversation, we'll begin with moderated questions and then open up to questions from the audience. However, because this is a webinar, if you're used to using the chat function, there is a separate Q&A portion on webinar. If you'd like to put your questions there, it's a little easier to filter them. If you don't, I'll just find them in the chat room and it'll be great. This webinar is being recorded so that it can be available and found both on the Facebook event page and at justlutheran.com. You will receive a follow-up email if you registered for the Zoom that will give you a link to the video and with a follow-up survey if you'd like to evaluate how we're doing and give us suggestions about how to do better in the future. If you would like to have questions on any of the other social media platforms, please use hashtag LutheransListen so it will help me find them a little easier. If you'd like to review any of these logistics, I will put them in the chat box and you can reread them. And before we start, I want to just formally acknowledge that sharing your voice in a town hall is a leap of faith. At some point, there might be a technology hiccup. My kids might come in and knock everything over. Let's embrace our humanness, however we find it today. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Lenny.
Give me 1 second here. I am having just a little bit of trouble with some technical stuff, so thank God for the humanness. All right. So I was sent some moderated questions for this town hall, and I guess we'll just start out by using a mutual invitation. So I will just start out by sharing my name, my context, and some of the intersections that I embody. And then I will invite someone else and ask you to do the same. And we'll do it in that format before we move on to the next question. So my name is the Reverend Lenny Duncan, and I am a Black queer minister currently serving in the Pacific Northwest. Can everyone hear me clearly? Am I not loud enough? I'm loud enough? Excellent.
You're not
Awesome.
quite loud enough. You need to be just a little louder, please.
Just a little bit louder, is that better?
Yes.
Much better.
Excellent, excellent. So like I said, I'm just going to start by introducing myself, and then through mutual invitation, invite someone else to do the same. We're just going to share a little bit about the intersections that we embody before we get into this conversation. I think that's an important piece to know where everyone is coming from. So I am the Reverend Lenny Duncan, and I am a Black queer ELCA minister serving currently in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of my work centers around Black liberation and the Lutheran response to that. And I would like to invite Vance to introduce perhaps. Oh, I'm sorry, and my pronouns are he and him. They are on side my little name there, but just want to make sure in case you can't see that you know my pronouns. And I'd like to invite Vance.
Osio Nagad, Galanche Dodo. Hello, everybody. My name is Galanch. My Cherokee name is Galanch, and my English name is Vance Blackfox. I am Cherokee and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I am Two Spirit, and I reside presently in San Antonio. It is now home, but I grew up in Oklahoma and have lived all over the United States. I presently serve as the communications director of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. However, today I'm representing my another organization that I help direct with my friend Kenna Kemp, which is called Otherwise. Otherwise is a cultural education, cultural immersion program that I've been running for about 10 years now in partnership with Kenna in Denver and in Borderland, Texas. And so I serve the church in a variety of ways beyond that, one of which is being the indigenous theologian for the Theological Roundtable for the ELCA, and as the creator and producer of the Vine Deloria Junior Theological Symposium at Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And so really pleased and happy to be here. Thank you, Megan and others for the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation. And I would like to invite Bea.
Hi, I am Bea Chun. I am a queer Lutheran pastor. I live in Oakland and serve a congregation in San Francisco. It's called St. Francis Lutheran Church. And you probably noticed that I have an accent. So I am an immigrant. I was born in Germany, and all my adult life I have been part of immigrant households. I've been married twice, and both of my spouses have also been immigrants. My first spouse from Hong Kong, and my wife is from St. Petersburg, Russia. So I feel like I have lived a multicultural life almost all my adult life. And I invite Drew to share.
Hi everyone, my name is Drew Stever. I use they, he pronouns. I am a queer transgender candidate for ordination in the ELCA. I was recently assigned to the Southwest California Synod. I just graduated Luther Seminary about 2 weeks ago. I'm official. I am originally from the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minnesota, and currently am living in Southern California. I am one of the co-founders of Queer-in-Teen Camp, which is a free online camp or interfaith camp for LGBTQ plus youth. Currently up and running right now. Yeah, I really like dogs, my partner's home-cooked meals, and the ocean. I'm gonna hand it off to Manda.
Hey, I am Manda Truchinski, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm currently the pastor of Christ the Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in San Jose. I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves and giving people a little bit of idea of our social locations, which are varied. I happen to know, I think, almost everyone but Bea personally, and I don't know if we've ever totally agreed on anything, so I'm very excited for this conversation. I guess my first question is, when we talk about intersectionality, it would be really hard not to talk about the struggle for Black lives right now, which is on the forefront of the consciousness, I think, of every Christian of conscious. I also know that that can be problematic for some of us, particularly those of us who are sitting in this discussion who have had some of the same systemic issues completely unaddressed and not getting some of the national attention. But I just want to talk about a little bit about how your identity has either helped you or perhaps even made it more complicated and nuanced to stand in solidarity with that movement, and how important it is for you perhaps to talk about that, or maybe it isn't in your context. But can we address that before we get to some of the questions that we had already agreed upon? Is that okay with everyone? Excellent. So I would love just to do this, whoever just wants to jump in, but because I don't want to do too much mutual invitation, because then everyone gets really polite because we're all Lutheran and then no one speaks up. So please, if you have something to say about this, just raise your hand in the box and just go in.
One of the things that I've heard about the national conversation happening about race right now is how we're all, the encouragement that I've heard is to resist the binary, to resist the this or that, to resist that it's one thing or the other completely. And I'm really grateful that as queer folk, we have the ability to hold a both and frankly, as Lutherans, we have the ability to do that as well. But to be able to say that it's not all protests are violent and not all, that's just the first one that pops to my head because it's the easiest, lowest hanging fruit. But there's so much about relationships in our congregations and in our communities that is trying to be shoved apart and creating this wall between, or this false binary that exists. And we know that that's not true by our own lived experience.
And that's a great point. I always thought that queer love had something to speak over revolution. The way that queer people love each other, the way that we experience compersion for our lovers' delight, the way that we talk about boundaries and really, do you know what I mean? Like all those things that we kind of naturally do as queer folks, I think is a blessing to these kind of movements too. Just our presence sometimes in solidarity. Drew, you had something to say, I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that, Lenny. Thank you. Some things that I've been thinking about, and some of my friends, especially in the trans community and like trans masculine or trans male presenting, male passing folks, being raised female and now presenting in a more masculine context or even passing as male. Multiple folks have asked me, like, Drew, what's it like? How are you going to respond? What's it like to be a white male in the world right now? And I just like, I don't know. I don't identify as male. On paper I do, but like personally I don't align myself with the binary identity as male. So I think like a better way to ask that question is like, what's it like to be like a white person right now? And I think there's a lot of discomfort because a lot of people don't know. We don't want to mess up how we respond to it. Like there's definitely a wrong way to respond to what's happening. but we don't want to mess up and respond. We don't want to respond wrong. We want to respond correctly and with compassion. So I think any response that comes from a place of compassion is in the direction that we want to be. But it's a very interesting space to be, where like I wasn't raised as male, so I think there's a lot of like cisgender men who you get messages from other men in your life that I didn't get. So I'm having to like almost learn and recreate new rules of how to be male or male passing. Yeah. And especially like in the Lutheran Church, being a predominantly white denomination, our call right now is to justice, is to action, is to responding. But I think also I grew up Midwest, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So we're not the first to make that step forward, and we're finding that we have to get out of our comfort zones and make that first step forward towards saying something and doing something.
Thank you for that. Vance or Bea, do you have something around this? I was just dwelling on like how perfection is really a function of white supremacy for a second, and how like not wanting to I know this is a church function, but not wanting to fuck up is like not as painful as the pain of being a person of color in this country, or being a Black, Indigenous, or person of color in this country. So, I'm sorry, Vance or Bea?
Yeah, so I live in San Antonio, and I mentioned before we started that, you know, I'd spent time in Minneapolis. And so Minneapolis and St. Paul do feel much like home, and there on occasion I have adopted Ho-Chunk parents and siblings and church family in Minneapolis, All Nations Indian Church, which is in the Phillips neighborhood right there in the midst of everything. And, you know, the Indian community came together to protect from rioters. But what we also saw from the Indian community, the Indigenous community, the Native community, was this, once again, building of solidarity, this language of solidarity with Black people, and what the Black community needs right now. It was really beautiful, because for me to watch our Indigenous folks do this, because it really wasn't. We practice what we hope other people to practice in general, that this is not about us. This is a time to really think about what Black community needs, how we stand with them, how do we share our power, how do we share the stage, how do we make sure that we are empathetic but not paralyzed. You know, and the reality is, when it comes to being arrested or brutalized by police, per capita, Natives actually have higher numbers of arrests and brutalization than Black people. And so I think that was really incredible that a lot of Native folks know this about ourselves. But in spite of that, we were still like, you know what, we're going to grieve and mourn George Floyd, and we're going to stand with our Black brothers and sisters who are hurting. And we know what that hurt feels like. So it was just beautiful. It was really beautiful to watch. I don't think it's going to end. I think our hope, though, is that Black people will also now stand more closely in solidarity with us. Because while Native people experience erasure in this country and around the world from white people, we also are not very, we're not very centered in Black lives either. So I hope that there's also reciprocation and a sense of community the other way as well as we move forward. But again, Black Lives Matter is centered for most of our organizations, and we have many who are doing justice work in the United States, but also just those folks on the ground. You know, we want to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and for Black people.
You know, that's really interesting, because often when we talk about intersectionality, we talk about it in a way as if it's always this positive thing, right? But there are these really complicated layers. And I'll give you an example. To escape Black trauma, a week and a half ago and finish my second book, I drove to Forks, Washington. And, you know, the state's on lockdown, but like I could afford to like go glamping for like 2 days, right? And just escape Black trauma, like stop seeing videos of George, stop having to retweet stuff, stop having white colleagues who I want to help reach out to me. Like, you know what I mean? Like I was just overwhelmed. But like I go up the Forks and I'm trying to sneak into the beach because all the national parks are closed, you know, and I hit the reservation there, which is the Ho Nation. And like, here's how they're responding to COVID. They've got it blocked off and you can't drive through and like turn around, you know what I mean? Because they know that the medical care system will not support them through this pandemic. And you know what I mean? So here I am, I'm vacationing, right? Or trying to escape Black trauma, which is like overwhelming. And then like I come across this entire other thing that I hadn't even considered in the midst of the pandemic because I was so obsessed with the way that it was negatively affecting Black bodies. Do you know what I mean? And so it's just really interesting. I'm sorry I'm rambling. I've had too many sodas this morning. Bea, do you would you like to share?
It's kind of complicated because I have so many things going around in my head. Don't even know where to start. I think I change my mind at least 5 times a day, thinking, where are we? What's happening? What's possible? What's hopeful? I'm excited about a few things. Like, I think there's more and more clarity where we are at and what needs to happen, and hopefully a much more collective will towards change. That, you know we need to dismantle white supremacy. It's not news. It's been not news for a long time, but I'm hopeful, and some days I'm holding my breath that perhaps the time has ripened. Perhaps something is really happening because, so I think the steps to take are becoming clearer and clearer, and sort of like people coming together around this clarity. It also goes both ways. I feel like the resistance to it is also shaping up quite clearly. Where I am kind of puzzled is with this, like the whole question of who is educating whom, and that some people should not be given the burden of education because education is everybody's responsibility, and yet it's important. Ignorance is so hurtful in so many ways. So that has to be addressed, but how and by whom? So I'm just putting out all these questions. Yeah, that's all I can say right now.
Thank you so much, beloveds, for indulging me. I just refuse to come to an ELCA event and not center Black lives as the first thing we do right now. Our first question for this group is, how do the intersections of your identity shape the way you are Lutheran? So in what ways that you are handcrafted and beautifully made by this loving God, like these intersections, these wonderful things about you, but how do they make you uniquely Lutheran, or perhaps shape the way you are Lutheran? So I'll just open that question up to anyone.
I think for me, what helps me a lot in my Lutheran outlook is this concept in Lutheranism, how human beings are both saints and sinners, and they both fully that thing at all times. It's not like a 50-50 proposal, like you are a saint from the neck up and a sinner from the neck down, or in any other kind of weird division, but you are 100% both these things. And that shapes also what we create, including the institutions that we create. And I think when it comes to institutions, I see basically 2 types. some institutions that are strictly from the get-go created to be oppressive and evil, and those institutions completely have to be erased, dismantled, abolished, whatever we can. But the institutions that we create for our liberation will also be affected by this saint-sinner dynamic. So even in places where I found things are life-giving in liberation movements, there is still often this, this other aspect. And so, and it can be a trap to either want to be in denial and say, no, 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 in this place we are all happy together. In this place we are all good. In this place we never hurt anybody else. And I think Lutheranism gives me sort of like a better realism about this and say, well, in that space too. And it's not a question of whether or not it will happen, it's just when it will happen. But then we have tools how to address, and that is, we speak up and we forgive. And we go to this place of grace and we begin again.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start calling on you.
So I'll go. You know, the reality is that there are so few Native people in our church, relatively speaking, that the church falls into the same habit that the rest of the world does by erasing us. In the rest of the world, we are statistically insignificant. That's why we're always othered, right? We're always put in the other category. That's our option. This church has done an incredible job in the past. I say the Lutheran church bodies have done an incredible job in the past of standing in solidarity with Native people, especially during the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s. While the civil rights movement was happening as well, Lutherans were supporting indigenous peoples and the things that they needed to find some freedom and some justice in their own communities, which was just incredible. And that fight created the National Indian Lutheran Board, which then served as a organization that supported the leaders of the American Indian movement and what the movement needed, but also as a funding source for all the small, tiny nonprofits that were trying to supplement or to make up for what the federal government did not provide in our treaty rights. And so some of those organizations still exist today, which is really amazing. And it has to do with the funding they received from this National Indian Lutheran Board. And it wasn't just natives, right? So we say National Indian Lutheran, it was white pastors and white lay leaders who were really about being allies. So I come from that heritage in the Lutheran Church, but I also was tagged as a very young 13-year-old person to be a leader in this church. And so for 30 years now, I've been having this same conversation. What does it mean to be Native in this church? But also, what does it mean to be a Native in this church who has a church that doesn't necessarily really get it anymore? Because at the beginning of the LCA, things kind of fell apart in regard to the support that was offered to Native people. In the beginning, maybe it was really good. I'm a product of that really goodness, but it's just fallen away. And then we have those moments where we are passing resolutions and memorials like the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. Yay, let's celebrate that. But then there's no actual movement behind it. And it models that whole reconciliation failure. We keep using the word reconciliation, and let's just stop. Let's stop, because reconciliation never happens. It might happen in between individuals or small groups, but it's not going to happen between large groups until the larger group, the offending group, really does something about it. And really does the work that needs to be done. So I just name all that because in the church, like the rest of my life, all these political things, all these system things impact who I am as a leader in this church, and therefore as a Lutheran or as a Christian who, or as a Native who's a Christian. But at the same time, one of the beautiful things about Lutheranism and the theology of Luther, or Lutheran theology, is that it fits really well. This grace theology fits really well in the way in which Native people tend to understand their relationship with one another, their relationship, our relationship with the creation, with the created, our fellow created, because we are created. So we're talking about, you know, all the trees and the grass and the rocks and the animals. And so that sense of being atoned for, and that sense of needing forgiveness may not be at the high level for Native people in our theology, though I'm a theologian, so not everybody's thinking like this, right? But at the same time, we get to be in relationship with a Christ, with another prophet, with another Savior, right? Who was sent by the Creator, and our relationship is connected by that love and that grace. Even if we didn't know, or no, we won't even that, we were not sinners, we still aren't sinners, because sinners is a foreign concept. Still, 500 years later, sinners is a foreign concept. So I have to name that if I'm going to say that grace is and the love is the what connects us to Christ and to God from our Christian perspective. I have to name that. The reason I say it that way is because we didn't know we were sinners until we were told we were. And even at that, didn't make us sinners just because we were told we were. And so all of that, all those intersections, all those ideas about how we have relationship with Christ, or maybe how the ideas I have as a theologian who's Indigenous, forms how I sit in this church, and quite frankly, why I continue to sit in this church, because my 30-year leadership history has not been one that's been very pleasant. Moreover, I have to reassess how much abuse am I willing to take in this abusive relationship. And some will say, oh, it's not intentional. No, but it's still abuse. It's still hurtful and harmful to me. But because I want to model that grace and that love that this brother and this Savior of mine, Jesus, modeled for all the folks in his tribal community back in the day, right? I'm going to sit here with everyone else and say, no, I'm going to sit here too, and I'm going to stay in solidarity, and I'm going to appreciate the wonderful, beautiful theology and the types of relationships that can grow from speaking that love language. So those are just some ideas about what it means for me as a Native person. So I'm speaking for me in this Christian context.
That's a rich. I was just going to say that idea of reparations over reconciliation is just a rich idea to dwell. I think, Drew, did you have your hand up too also? I'm sorry. I hate moderating these things. I feel like I'm the bad guy in every interaction. I'm sorry.
Okay, Manda, did you have a response to that?
No, Lenny, chill out. You're doing fine, man. This is good. Well, I just hear so far everybody talking in their own way about paradox and about how we hold many things at once. And I wonder how many for you that your identity as a queer person or your queer identity helps you to do that more. For me, it helped me do it more easily than an explanation of Lutheran theology ever did, right? Like I could be taught Lutheran theology all day and be taught about both and Satan Sinner and all of that. But until I had a lived experience of that, it didn't take, you know, it doesn't make as much sense. Am I the only one?
Yeah. I will also, just to clarify, I'm Two Spirit, so I don't identify as queer. So you're okay to use that language, but just know that that doesn't include me, and that's okay. That's okay, because queer for Two Spirit people is still very much a white construct and doesn't really include us. But then that's fine. We're still in a relationship, and we still have similar experiences.
So for you, I hear that queer is also not an umbrella community term.
No.
Thank you for telling me that, Vance.
Yeah, so this idea of, I think, the duality and paradox, I think what I'm experiencing and witnessing now in our history of the Lutheran Church and just like the world is that creation is complex, humanity is complex. The Lutheran Church, it was created out of part of it, I think, was created out of addressing the complexity of what it means to be human. You can't just pay $1 and have your sins be forgiven. There has to be some relationality aspect in part of that healing. Yes, there's the sinner-saint duality, but I think also for someone who exists beyond or outside of a binary experience, it's more than that. It is that, and it's not that. It's more than that. So I think what's happening right now is that the Lutheran Church, the Christian church in general, I think has gotten really good about sweeping things under the rug. Like, oh, we have an issue, we have a scandal, let's just like deal with it in-house and sweep it under the rug and not really address it as part of a wider church. When the wider church that's your community. If you have an issue at home, you talk about it with your community at home. And now all these things are coming out. The rug's been lifted up and just like thrown out on the curb. Hopefully someone will come by it, but they might look at it and see how stained and moldy it is. They don't even want the rug. But so all these things are coming to light, and the church is having to have really hard questions about, we're having to look at ourselves and our stuff. And I think there's a lot of people within the church who are part of the quote unquote majority, straight, white, cisgender, able-bodied male, that haven't had to look at their stuff in such an intense way before. And for me, as a queer person, as a trans person, I think all we do is look at our stuff. You know, I'm constantly thinking about like, wow, I present in the world as a white male. Every interaction I have, like how much of that stems from that presentation. I think people who are not of the heteronormative experience, we've gotten really good at looking at our stuff and talking about it, so we aren't afraid to have hard conversations. To be a Lutheran, I think, is to have hard conversations and to not be afraid to look at our stuff. And like, it's the Reformation for a reason. We're constantly reforming, constantly evolving, transforming, and growing. It's not about being comfortable. It's not about, you know, being okay with how things have always been. I think being Lutheran is looking for ways to do things new and to do things in ways that are more equitable for everyone.
I mean, it's an interesting thing, right? Because like the way I show up at the Lutheran Church is really different than the way I show up in Black church spaces. I'm not the stereotypical Black male preacher, although I am long-winded, often think I need the mic, and often think I am right. But I mean, in a lot of ways, I don't show up like that. And so showing up as a Black Lutheran and knowing that like I'm part of this tradition of like Rudy Featherstone, of like the Perros, of like, you know what I mean, like other people who sacrificed along the way, Reverend J. Hugh Jones, and you know what I mean, like this rich couple 100-year history that I'm, you know, only been grafted into in the last 5 years. But showing up as a queer man in that space, that, let's be honest, that like, you know, I can just say this as a Black man, and like some of the internalized homophobia, transphobia, and patriarchy in the Black church is completely unaddressed. And it's so hard to show up in those spaces, and that's why like I'm like so clear about identifying as queer, which is something that I can fall into, right? I can fall under that umbrella. It's interesting that Vance said that, because like that's the only umbrella I have, because what white people forget is that I am a captured person who was taken hostage. An entire family's fate and history was changed. And I was brought to a continent and a culture that was not my own. And, you know, and so like, you know, like I cling to some of these cultural things, but like Blackness is such a police state. And it's policed by whiteness. It's policed by the church. It's policed by our theologians. It's policed by the Conference of Bishops. It's policed by church-wide. It's policed by our own members. And then sometimes it's policed by your colleagues. But the stuff that really gets me that I want to talk about with you folks, like my tender spot is when it's policed by our own people. And so like, I don't know how I'm like one of the first 5 openly queer Black male rostered leaders on the Proclaim roster with our history, because we know that's not our lived experience, right? But like, how is that, you know? And so sometimes showing up in Lutheran spaces, it's incredibly complicated because I get dropped into several buckets that don't necessarily reflect my call or ministry to liberation. Why I love being a Lutheran so much. I love Lutheranism because it's so contentious. Like, I love the fact that there's a rough outline of the tent, and we're always trying to stretch it a little bit more to fit more people in, and we argue about that, and sometimes we lose friendships over that, and sometimes like we lose calls over that, and sometimes careers are affected by that, and sometimes, you know, and that's just the roster leader's perspective. The people are affected in whole community groups and the ripples of all that stuff. It can be complicated for me to show up to Lutheran spaces. It just really can. But I try and show up as all of me. I try and show up as authentically as I can. And, you know, and really not care. Like, I just have little time for people's fragility. Or like bullshit from church leaders. Like, those are like 2 things I just don't have the tolerance for right now. And maybe in a couple weeks I will, or maybe in a couple months I will, but like, just not today. The second question I want to float, just real rapid fire, if you can, what are one thing that people hit you up about in concern with one of your intersectional identities or one of the ways you show up? That you just wish they would research on their own. Like, stop asking me, like Google, like google.com. Like, so what's one thing that's just kind of rapid fire you're kind of sick of answering the question of? And that's open to anyone.
I got to tap out of this one. I can't answer it. I have too much privilege to say that I'm sick of answering questions. Frankly, at the end of the day, I probably have more emotional bandwidth than anyone in our community, or at least in the LGBTQ community. So I'll take the hits. Ask me anything. I can handle it. And please ask me instead of one of my siblings that has a lot more going on and a lot more pressure every day.
Yeah, I mean, if someone asks me a question, I try really hard to receive that as, oh, you trust me enough to ask this question. And it could be a question phrased with words that, you know, some might paint it as, or like coin it as ignorant. It might come off as an ignorant question, but they're asking because they don't know. And they might not know the right words to use to ask the question. So I just try to receive the question as oh, this is a relationship moment. You're trying to step toward me and ask the question because you don't know and you trust me. And I try really hard to answer it, but I also like try really hard to check in with myself. And I just think like, you know, if I'm not receiving this question compassionately, or if I just don't have it in me to answer, I point them in the direction of some folks that I trust who would be good resources for them. But for me, like, there's nothing really off the table. There's nothing really off the table for me.
So, you know, I whine a little bit, not too much, I hope, about how little everyone knows about Native people. But I also, quite frankly, because I myself happen to be fairly culturally competent in a variety of cultures, educated on purpose, mostly because when I am out in Lutheran circles, I'm usually the only Native. So I didn't want to walk up to someone and be at ground zero ever when I'm having conversations and or in the beginning building a relationship. We're certainly going to still learn from one another, but I refuse to be at level zero, refuse. So, and I refused from a very early age, but I think that's because I had some really good mentors who taught me better. And that's because they understood that we don't have privilege, especially when we're the only ones in a circle, right? So would say there's plenty of questions that become tiresome, but I don't think that there are any questions that I'm tired of people asking. My whole church career has been based on being a teacher. And I was formed to be that at a very early age in this church because I was the only one. And so people wanted to know about Indian people, which is great. I mean, I can't turn that away, right? Now, there are other Native people and there are other people of color who are tired of answering those questions or being asked certain questions, and that's totally fine. But I refuse to turn anybody away, even if I might roll my eyes first, because I need for people to know about me. I need for people to know about my nieces and nephews. I need for there to be more enlightened people about my culture and about people of color in general, so that my nieces and nephews don't have to do as much, maybe hopefully, as much work as I might have had to do in this church or any church. So that's why one of the reasons why I created Otherwise and have been doing cultural immersion and immersive education for as long as I possibly can, or have been doing, I should say, and will continue that for as long as I possibly can, because I want folks to have a very real opportunity to ask the questions that keep them, like we were speaking earlier, make people afraid, right? Stop them from moving forward. I'd rather them have a place safe with me and the people I work with to ask those questions that they just always thought they shouldn't ask because it might appear racist. Well, it probably is, but I need for you to know the answer. I need for you to be open to letting us correct you. So that then you can go and share with your peers, right, and your other privileged family, the right answers to these questions and the information. So, I will continue to build resources and I will continue to build programming that will be safe, quite frankly, for white people. I always say, weirdly enough, for whatever reason, I think the Creator called me to help white people heal. I always talk about how Native people need to heal, Black people need to heal, Asian people need to heal, other brown and Black people need to heal, LGBTQ folks, Two Spirit people need to heal, right? But the reality is that white people really need to heal. When it comes to Indigenous community, when people talk about us need to heal, absolutely, tons of atrocity, over and over and over, systemic stuff and interpersonal stuff, trauma that lasts with us, we need to heal. But if we're having to heal from all the trauma, it is my opinion and other people's opinion that white people have to heal from the hate. If that trauma is genetically and otherwise in our spirit, in our genetics, well, guess what? The hate is too in white people. And there has to be healing from the hate. So I want to be a part of that. The Creator has called me to journey with white people. I can't imagine any other reason why the Creator made me Lutheran if that wasn't for that purpose, and a Lutheran leader at that. So I'm thankful for having been the experience to be this Lutheran leader, but I think this is the reason why I want to journey with my siblings who need that healing.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I really struggle with this. I got to be honest with you, and it's only and this is why I am really approachable. Like, you can contact me on Twitter at Lenny Duncan. You can contact me on Facebook. I mean, there's tons of people who will attest to, if you hit me up, I'm going to hit you back and I'm going to give you an answer, and I'm going to do it in the most loving way I can. But when I listen to the leadership, particularly of Black women organizers, lately a lot of the calls have been like, the resources are out there, the information is out there. And I think what at least what I'm finally starting to express is like, you're either on the side of dismantling white supremacy and you realize that it's probably the most important thing for the church to do in the next 50 years, or you're not. And that touches with, I mean, that's just me. That's not everyone. That's certainly where I'm at. And so sometimes I really struggle. I mean, I also went into like our main clergy room on Facebook and, put up a post and said that I'm 100% willing to be a resource for any of my peers, you know what I mean? And answered like, about 36 like messages, and like showing up at random Zoom calls for, kids' confirmation classes in a couple weeks and stuff like that to talk about these issues. So like, it's not that I don't want to be a resource to the church I love, but I also think that like, the onus is on white folks right now. And I think you really touched on something I may be scarred I try not to talk from my wounds. I try and only talk from my scars. And I may be scarred from white supremacy, but I'm not sick from it. I'm not infected with it. And there's a difference. And I think in community, there's some healing and some liberation that has to happen for everyone. I mean, for me as a liberation theologian, I know that me fighting for my freedom means I'm also fighting for my oppressor's freedom. And they just can't see the bars of their own cage. But they're just as trapped as me. And I love them enough to say that I should be free. But wow, really good conversation. Sorry, I'm just so excited. I keep forgetting other people are watching this, and I feel like we're just all on the phone call together. I'm so sorry, beloveds. What is a recommendation that you have for congregations, either in the Synod or within the ELCA, so they can minimize bias, so they can minimize harm to people, so they could perhaps even start to deconstruct some of those structures that continually harm folks maybe like us or other folks we know in their congregations? We often get, where do we start? I have a direct recommendation for them locally that they can do right now, but I would love to hear some of your guys' feedback.
So I have two thoughts. So one, I'm seeing right now, a pastor friend of mine in Minnesota is, they're having like an open confession as a church, as a congregation, to naming, like, I confess their role in a racist system, sexist system, a transphobic, homophobic, ableist system, and then having a confession and forgiveness. I think it's like they're having it for as long as they find it necessary, which is probably going to be forever. But confessing to the ways that we've caused harm and seeking ways that we can forgive ourselves and forgive each other. As a trans person, gender and the language we use around gender is frequently on my mind. So the language that we use around God, many communities still use male language in referring to God, and God is bigger than the language any language, every language. So talking about, just starting with, how do we talk about God as a church? And then maybe moving toward, okay, let's introduce new ways of talking about God. Also, if your church is not a reconciling in Christ congregation, talk about why that might be, because I think reconciling in Christ, which is, you're basically saying that you're open and affirming of, in my context, the LGBTQ identities, but it's for all identities, racial, sexual identities, gender. But if you're not a reconciling congregation, which in my mind is the bare minimum, just having that status, becoming reconciling in Christ, but then once you become reconciling,
it's like a white people merit badge, right? It's like the least you can do. It's like getting an NPR sponsor sticker in your car as a church. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but that's the bare minimum. And if you don't want to do the work beyond that, don't even do it. But the point of becoming reconciling is to do the work to figure out how you can become not just open and affirming, but celebrating and including and integrating. You want those voices to be uplifted in your congregation, and inviting those voices to your congregation to share.
Isn't it like doing collectively that inner work that you talked about earlier, doing on your own? Like, I always have to look at my stuff. As congregations, we have to look at our stuff. Mm-hmm. And at least that does that.
Yeah, at least start that process. And I think a lot of folks are like, I don't even know where to begin. Well, the least you can do is talk about a reconciling in Christ congregation.
Right, because I mean, from my perspective as a leader, I've moved on from radical welcome. I'm into radical affirmation. Like, I'm beyond the fact, like, should queer folks be here at the church? They should be our bishops. We should be following their leads en masse. Just by the way that they structure a community, it's the closest thing I've seen to the Book of Acts in a long time, other than like person of color or Black or Indigenous communities. And so it's just surprising to me sometimes that we don't that we're still in like this welcome conversation when I've moved on to affirmation. Like I'm just ready to follow. So I'm sorry. Someone else. The question is, what sort of recommendations do you have for congregations in the Synod or in the ELCA to minimize bias or to start addressing some of the issues that we're kind of getting around, but we haven't really got to the meat of?
Before you mentioned that the women you're talking to are saying the resources are out there, right? And I think that's true for everything that we need to minimize bias around. There are resources that exist. There is the internet, and you can find any community, have access to any community that you want, which is good because there's a diversity of stories that need to be heard. But I think one of the things that I've seen be effective and that I would encourage is to center those stories in your community. So even if that's not your story, or if it might not be the majority as you see it, or maybe not even, but especially if that's not the majority as you see it or your story, to make that story your center. Buy those books, get that liturgy that is written by those people that whoever you are not, read those stories, hire those teachers, call those pastors, all of that exactly.
Also, don't eat them in the process. For the love of God, stop eating them. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. One would hope that if you're calling them and asking them to be your leader, that you're going to be, you know, following them or working with them as an equal partner at the very least, right? But it's doing all that inner work to say, why wouldn't this relationship work if you're eating them? Yeah, buy those resources, invest that money in those places. And even if you don't understand why, do it as an act of trust, do it as an act of faith, to invest your money and your resources and your time and your energy in those places, even if you don't understand why. They say where your treasure is, your heart will be also, right? Start investing your heart in places that you think are not normal or majority, whether that be LGBTQ issues or issues around race or ethnicity or culture, immigration, all that.
And a requested question from the last town hall, right around this area, is what have you personally seen that's worked? I know, Vance, you've done a lot of work around the ELCA. Bea, maybe you've seen some stuff, particularly in solidarity with other immigrant communities. But what stuff have you seen that's happened that's been effective in your community or in other communities?
Well, nothing, I guess I would say nothing's been effective in our community. The effectivity in our community is being deleted. I was on a webinar last night with Reverend Nelson Rebel, who was a pastor there also in the Sierra Pacific Center, Synod rather, and with another Native leader, and we're talking about how, you know, I looked it up there as well, and I'm having these conversations with non-natives, mostly white folks around the church leaders, who, you know, speak to, well, we need to grow Native leaders. There's only one person going to seminary who is Native in any of our ELCA seminaries, and she's working on a PhD. I'm taking a break from seminary because I need to stop having to pay for my own schooling for a while. And yet I was the only seminarian in any of our ELCA seminaries for years. And I was even asked to help fundraise for other people of color for scholarships for their schooling, but no support for me. So that for me is testimony from the church and witness from the church that, you know, nobody's really thinking about the import for growing Native leaders anymore in the church. So in 50 years, we went from being the denomination or the denominations, Lutheran church body, who was the largest proponent in support of Native people, to, you know, one that just doesn't really care. Because every time we have an opening in one of our congregations, it's certainly going to be a white pastor, usually near retirement, who is willing to go there, because our communities are not in sexy places. So I have to say that. I have to say there's nothing. There are some successes, and there's still some Native pastors out there, and there's some white pastors who are doing a decent job in our communities. But we have to reevaluate what we've done, what we're doing to our Native communities. And there's been, you know, progress here and there, but not really. So what I will say is that, we in the church continue to use this word accompaniment. And it's not one of my favorite words. It still marks of and speaks of, lends itself to paternalism. And there may not be any way in which around that, even if we call it something else, but we have not taught people learning or speaking accompaniment language to get around it, or that there's a goal to get past it, that there's something beyond accompaniment, that it certainly is a partnership and a relationship, a deep relationship with people who are different than yourself for the sake of your journey on this earth, not theirs. For 500 years, or let's say 400 years, just my number, 400 years, mission work meant Christianizing Indians. And for the last 100 years, mission has meant service project, mission trips, and helping the poor, charity. That's not mission. Mission is relationship building. Mission is being in relationship. And I always say to those those youth groups, those youth directors and pastors who do mission trips and service trips, and they hate hearing it, but I say it anyway. If you can't do mission well in your own community, don't come to my brown, black, gay, queer, Two Spirit community and do mission here, because you're still not doing it well. So why would you come and dump it here? Learn better. Come to Otherwise so we can teach you how to do better, right? So there are congregations, however, I believe, that are doing better because their pastors have taught themselves and have sought counsel and wisdom from folks who are doing themselves, and they're building relationships to be in partnership with congregations in maybe more impoverished communities or not, in different places around the world. And who might be doing really well, really good mission line community, but that's really seldom. I could name those. One is my brother's congregation, Pastor Manuel Retomosa in San Diego at St. Andrews. They do a great job of doing mission well, and being a relationship, long-term relationship with places, and or doing immersion to teach their young people how to be in better relationship with people different themselves and their own communities. So yeah, so I'll stop there, but and that's very native-centric, that answer, but I don't want to necessarily speak for other experiences too much.
No, thank you for that. One thing I hate about Zoom is that when everyone's been sharing, like just, from my church tradition, I'm like, don't be nice. Tell them. And there's like all these amens. So I'm pretty animated over in my box here. I just, it's just so interesting, right? Like one thing that you said that really struck with me is like, the games I have to play as a black man trying to be a church, a mission developer, as we call it, or church planter in this church. Like it has to be hip, and it has to be like in a certain area, and it has to hit a certain demographic, or most of my siblings don't care about doing anti-racist ministry in a certain way. They're just not interested unless I add like a little bit of social media flair to it, and like how exhausting that is, and how paternalistic that is. That that we have to do these things for the white gaze sometimes just to get attention, to places that I think the church's heart is at, if our leadership would just offer it to people in a way that seemed inviting. But that's just me. I don't speak for everyone. One last thing before we open it up for questions, because I know we're at that time. Is there anything else you'd like to share that you just like is on your heart right now that you wanna say? I know just briefly for me, James Baldwin, and I've been calling that ancestor into every space I've been showing up in. Invited us to listen to the report of poets about our society. And so I would encourage you to read Black poets and listen to their report on society, because empires rise and fall, but poets tend to seem to last the test of time. And so listen to the report of your poets is what I would encourage the church. But is there anything else that anyone feels that they would like to say?
I think I'll say this because and this is me. I don't think Amanda's going to request this, require this. I don't think, but just make sure that we're all in the same understanding of my comments about Spirit early and not being queer. There are certainly people who identify as Two Spirit who believe other than I do, but I tend to be a little older school when it comes to the definition of Two Spirit. And so what I'll say about that then is that this church also doesn't understand Two Spirit. And even our gay or LGBTQ and queer communities don't understand Two Spirit. And they think it's just that it's only, oh, they're gay native. Well, gay native is sometimes different than Two Spirit, and each tribe has a different definition for what that means for them. And so I would just challenge us in this Two Spirit and queer community to nurture that conversation, to push other folks to understand more about that part of Native culture and what that meant for us. Because, and one of the reasons why, I and others kind of push back on, no, we're not a part of the queer communities, because of why we have been oppressed so much that you're pushing yet another oppression on top of us when that didn't include us to begin with. And in the gay community, oftentimes Native people were not included, period, even before we were, calling ourselves Two Spirit again. And so that I would just say that that's a little more about that and the importance of understanding that part of Native culture in all of our communities, including the queer and LGBTQ community. I think that would be really helpful. Usually I'm the only one that anybody's ever met, right? In this church especially. And that's just a lot of expectation. So.
Beloved, I just want to model for a second. That's the first time I've encountered that distinction as a queer Black man, and I want to honor you sharing that with us for a second. I just want to hold that, because exactly what we're talking about is what you just did, even amongst people who most would consider to be your peers or in the same bucket as you. But yet you've explained this distinction to us. So can we all just take a deep breath and just honor that contribution? Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who is now going to do the Q&A section.
Yeah, we have a slightly related question. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, so apologies to the person who posted this on Facebook. There is a desire for people to try to figure out how to have welcoming statements and language that they can put in welcoming statements. And there is a desire for those welcome statements to not sound performative, but to be a true expression of the welcome that they're wanting to offer to people. And so the question is, how can people craft a welcome statement that helps people who are Black, people who are Native, Two Spirit people, LGBTQIA people, feel like they are a part of the welcome in a church? And when you figure that out, you're all going to get giant amounts of grant money for having solved all of the evangelism problems of our church.
Yeah, let me try that first. I want to go first then. I want to go first. If you're offering money, I'm down. I'll help everybody. I've already said that. So Don't give it away then.
Don't give it away then. If they're offering money, hold on to it for a second.
Right. I should probably listen to that. But this welcome thing is really important to me. And some of you have been a part of places where you've seen me do a welcome of sorts that's a little different. That in Indian country, and we call that the land acknowledgement. In places like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, it's just normal. Anytime a government agency or a church group or whomever gathers, they just do a land acknowledgement, acknowledging the land upon which they're standing at that moment and whose land they're standing on, whose stolen land they're standing on. And so I just think, that land acknowledgement can also include a welcome statement in addition to acknowledging the indigenous folks that are there. And I just wish that our church would take the lead on this, because some of the Episcopals do it well, but not in mass. And I just think that the Lutheran that this is one of those the things that we could do is just really adopt the land acknowledgement, but that requires then investigation and continued education about the people whose land you're on. So I have a friend a white friend who just wrote a blog, and I'm going to send it to you in a private message, and you can share it how you wish, Megan, that talks about how her process as a white person. She credits me and others that we worked together on a website that I'm also going to send to you that has a huge timeline for the last, 500 plus years written from an indigenous perspective. But all that to say, she has crafted a really nice one that can be emulated and or just be one that allows you to have some new language for land acknowledgement and explains what a land acknowledgement is, because a lot of folks, again, don't know what that is. But you could also include in there a welcoming statement for other communities, as long as you're first naming indigenous land first. So I'll stop. I'll send that to you now.
Yeah, no, my former congregation, Jehu's table was on the land of the Carnissi people, and we thanked them every service, and we honored whose land we were on, particularly because that area of East New York at the time was also, after the Carnissi people were forced off, then it was land for free slaves, and then they were forced off, right? And so the land had this history of terrorism to it that we acknowledged.
I think one thing, so when I see welcoming statements, I'm just going to name, I attended the only ELCA seminary in the country that is not reconciling in Christ. And it's situated in the most progressive, one of the most progressive cities in the country. And it's not, like I said, it's not the bare minimum. They have a welcoming statement, but they are not reconciling in Christ. So to be a reconciling community, I think communities need to think about, ask themselves, are you creating the statement for yourselves so that you get more members? Or are you doing it, why are you doing it? You have to think about that. I think a lot of people they're worried about the numbers of their congregation. So if they create this statement, they might get more people in the pews, and that's just not always the case. And you have to sit with that. But Megan, the words you said, I thought were really great, that you want a statement that doesn't come off as performative or something like that. And I think that, like, raw honesty in your statement is what people want to see. I want to see a church that says, like, we're not perfect. But we are trying to create a community that acknowledges that and can live in that space. And we're doing the work. So not only do we have this statement, but here are the ways that we are doing the work that are in alignment with that statement.
Yeah, I mean,
that has to be backed up.
Yeah, no.
Right? Then your actions have to reflect it.
Oh, I hate Zoom.
I'm sorry. No, go.
I have so much Zoom gloom. I can't. I was just gonna say, yeah, exactly. Like Drew, like if like how can, like, if your congregation can pastorally say that we are going to really F this up sometimes, and we acknowledge that, and we know that, because the people I know in the work who matter the most are the ones who you call out, and they sit through the uncomfortability, and they show up the next day like nothing happened, right? They've adjusted, they've done some study, they've done some self-reflection, they've maybe even approached you and said, like, hey, I'm sorry I hurt you this way. But all that's not even necessary for me is if you just stay engaged in the work. I don't even necessarily need you. If I call you out, you acknowledge it, and then, like, we move on, and then you show up the next day with your lunch pail and you're ready for work, right? Then I know, and a welcome statement that acknowledges that Jesus Christ gives us the ability to fall flat on our face and make fools of ourselves. Like, we're supposed to be failing spectacularly for the kingdom of God, right? If church is failing, why not fail big? Why not fail spectacularly? Why not fail so big that we make such a noise that there might be a Lutheran witness in the next 50 years?
Yeah, the name I would give all of that is vulnerability. I want a community who can model vulnerability, because it shows me that they're not going to tell me that they think they're right? They think that there's room for growth and room for transformation, and that repentance is an actual thing that we do. And beyond that, I think explicit. I need you to be explicit. I need you to say the words I need you to not erase me by talking around my identity.
Yeah, I at JU's at the time, we were the only church that I knew of, other than like two others, that mentioned that poly families or polyamorous families were welcome at our church. And I didn't know that was like a radical thing. I just like threw it on there on our welcome statement because I was like, yeah. Like I just didn't even think. I was just like, yeah. And then like someone emailed me and was like, yo, I've never seen that before, like on a church's website. And I was like, really? Like I just, I just don't think sometimes. I just love people too much. I don't know.
Well, I'm not going to be mad at you for that. One question we had, Lenny, is people were hoping you would define the way you're using the word policed, like about being policed, because they want to make sure they're on the same wavelength with you.
Yeah, when we talk about someone's identity being policed, it's the acceptable ways that I'm able to show up as Black in church spaces and in American spaces. So there's acceptable levels of Blackness that fluctuate depending on the political situation, cultural phenomenons, and sometimes what artist is #1 on the Grammy Top 100. And so it's a moving target, Blackness. So and so these are the ways that it's policed. Like a lot of people love to quote Dr. King to me, and they think it's like this moment, right? They think they're connecting with me. Right, and even when they quote the radical Dr. King to me, they think they're connecting to me. But like Dr. King was dressed to the nines every day. Dr. King never used words that even seemed close to threatening sometimes compared to other leaders of the time. Dr. King played by all the rules. He worked with the white establishment, and yet you still killed him. So you don't get to quote Dr. King to me. Nor do you get to tell me that's the only way I should live. So you're saying the only way I should live is to be an acceptable leader that eventually you can assassinate and everyone can pretend that racism died that day? No, thank you. The second thing is the states of Blackness. Can I show up in a hoodie at a Senate assembly? Can I show up with my dreads just hanging out at a Senate assembly? Will people take me seriously if I show up that way? If I show up and I'm blasting hip hop, which is like, the poetry and the psalms of my people in the midst of our exile in this new Babylon, but yet if I pull up at a church blasting that, so these ideas around Blackness, what's acceptable Blackness, are all sort of like modeled for the white gaze. And what happens because of internalized oppression is that sometimes Black people end up being the enforcers of it too. I don't think this is a mostly Black crowd, so I demur to discuss our internal community dissension with you. I do not believe that is for you. But I will say that much like other forms of internalized oppression, we end up policing it ourselves. We see this from queer, cis men, white men, right? They want to police trans women all the time, or trans bodies all the time. They want to police how queer people of color show up. And so we start cracking the whip better than the oppressor. So it's a dual sword. And so, yeah, that's what I mean about the acceptable ways I'm allowed to be Black. I'm allowed to be Black in this church, and don't get me wrong, and I'll shut up with this. I'm allowed to be Black in this church because I have a gift for gab, I wrote a book that some people like, and I have a social media that's snarky. Not because you respect Blackness. I know that. I'm not a fool. Right? And so you have to, you even have to fight for how much Blackness you can say, because now when I show up, people expect me to say that thing. But when I first came to seminary, there were questions on whether or not I would be ordained. So that's what I mean by policing Blackness.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Vance, we have a question for you. And I don't know if it's a question you know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's the status of Oaks Indian Mission?
I've not been a part of that organization for a few years, so I'm not able to answer that question.
You at least understood the fullness of the question, which is it's good. So, well, and then the next question is one that's maybe for everyone. There is a desire of some of the people who are watching to have more resources and connect with gender diverse and sexuality diverse and all of the ways of expressing themselves youth. I say it that way because their language changes more often than my knowledge of all of young people's ways of identifying. What ideas do you have about how people could connect with LGBTQ, Two Spirit youth who are in the world in a faithful way?
Did they say why they want to connect with them?
Let me double check. I think they're specifically putting together like resource lists and toolkits. So I assume that they've already got some connections organically with youth.
There's a whole sermon in what Manda just said, though.
No, it was a good question.
I mean, but that's what makes the difference, right? Like that's the whole conversation we were having about what questions are you tired of answering or what can you ask me? It's all about why we're being approached and how we're being approached. Are you objectifying me and you want me to be your XYZ friend so that you can say you have that? Or are you fetishizing me? Or are you trying to save me and change me? All of that matters. And resources for LGBTQ youth, I think, is what we were talking about here. If you're trying to fix them, I have no words for you because they don't need your fixing. But if you want to figure out how to affirm youth and create safe spaces for them to grow into beloved adults, I think it depends on where your town is. And I don't doubt that wherever you live, there is an organization that's already doing that. And if you don't know how to do that, that you need to go learn from them in person. And I know that's really hard. I know it would be really easy instead to have a book with a checklist in the back of the book, and then you can just start doing all the things on the checklist. And if you could order them all on Amazon, it would be even easier to check all those things off, but that's unfortunately not how it works. It's relationship, like Vance was talking about before. That's all that this is building personal relationships and building a personal relationships that opens up the transformation that Christ brings. I think it always starts with being vulnerable. And by being vulnerable, I mean approaching a relationship knowing that you're going to be the one to be ignorant and wrong and needy.
I don't know. I always think that the root issue is white supremacy, and that if you don't address white supremacy, you'll never be able to like have queer people in your church. And I have some resources that I can link to that. But like heteronormativity is a byproduct of white supremacy in this country. It didn't happen in a vacuum. And the fact that those sort of relationships were grafted onto scriptural stories and made to fit a post-1950s modern paradigm of the American family is not a mistake. That happened in the American church very, very intentionally. And you know, and it's all in service to white supremacy, in my opinion.
Well, I'm gonna ask my own question now because I get to, because I have video and voice, and I took everyone else off of video and voice. What are the things that fuel your faith from wherever it comes from? What keeps your faith going? And I'm gonna start with Drew.
I was just thinking the first things that came to mind was youth. I am now the executive director of this online camp for LGBTQ plus youth, and we had an all camp roundup this morning. And you know, when you get 50 youth on a Zoom call, once you unmute them, it's like beautiful holy mayhem. They start like we talked about books that I've never heard of for about 10 minutes, but they're all LGBTQ plus all of these identities and coming from different parts of the world. All over the world are coming to the Zoom call. And, you know, they're hearing that they're getting a lot of hope from hearing our speakers, but I'm getting a lot of hope from them because their drive for change and their drive for community is so like, it's like so electric coming out of them. And I can feel it from the computer screen. So that is fueling my faith in the world, in humanity, in all creation right now.
What about you, Bea?
The moment I read about Camp quarantine, I was so excited. You know, it's not just for you, it's for, and thank you for posting and telling us about it, because even a little bit remote from you, I can also feel that energy. It's wonderful. What fuels my faith? I think that I don't know how to explain that, that God just wouldn't give up on me, no matter how many times I get so many things wrong, or there's always this surprising presence that I cannot explain. So I struggle for words, and yet I'm a preacher. I'm supposed to roll these things off my tongue and say, this is how my faith lives. And yet it's in a way, it is a gift that it is there. And it is often the most alive the more I am in a place where suddenly all my tricks don't work anymore. You know, when I feel like, okay, I'm running out of whatever I used to know, and now I don't know anything anymore, and I guess I don't know what the next step is. That's usually the best place for things to happen. Yeah.
Manda?
I'm ready for the world to burn. I know that sounds really like maybe not great and constructive, but yeah, I'm ready for Jesus to come and burn this all down so that the kingdom of God can be revealed. And every once in a while, there's a little tiny fire and the kingdom is revealed. And that keeps me going until the day when it's all transformed.
Vance?
Repeat the question for me again, so I'm not just rambling. I'm gonna focus.
Sure.
What helps your faith be reignited in times like these?
Mhm. I think that my faith or my journey with Jesus is most, I guess, fulfilling and exciting when I join on Sunday mornings with my congregation there in Minneapolis, All Nations Indian Church, on Zoom. And we have, depending upon the Sunday, maybe, frankly, attendance might be up a little bit. And we might have, 10 to 30, which is a good number for us. And I don't live there. I'm there probably once every month, and I get to preach. But to hear the stories of activism and advocacy and concern and prayer for our Indigenous peoples, our elders, our children in the community there, but also all of our neighbors, and how we protect one another and how we protect the sacred, which are the stories of our elders and the livelihoods of our elders and our babies. And so getting to engage in those conversations, because our church, even in person, is a little different than most churches, where community happens and worship happens through exchange. Sometimes we'll visit for an hour before we start service, and that visiting was more church than the service was. Sometimes, unless I'm preaching, of course, then then the service is incredible. But so I'm and witnessing the stories of the folks who are on the front line who are Indigenous, and hearing their words of solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with Black people, but also how they organize the Native community to protect the Native community from whether they be instigators from the outside or rioters and looters and others who may not be considered desirable in the community because of their needs, whether it be homeless or otherwise. So just getting to hear those stories, that reignites my faith weekly. And I'll be, weirdly enough, a little sad when we're able to go back to church in person, because that means that I won't get to be there. So I'm really valuing that time right now. I would also say that my faith is always reignited or feels a bit more full when I speak with my mother. I was remiss earlier when I talk about my identity. My identity is only wrapped up in that my mother is Anita, my grandmother is Sharon, my great-grandmother is Oklahoma Rebecca, my great-great-grandmother is Bertha, and a list could go on. I am not anyone without that heritage and without that lineage and without that wisdom. And so speaking with my mother and getting to hear her preach to me in her gentle way, or maybe not so gentle sometimes, which I need, is preaching my need to be kind, and to be loving, and to stand firm, and also be confident. So getting to speak with her, and then knowing that the reason why I've been raised up to be those things is because I'm doing something that hopefully will impact, like I said earlier, the lives of my nieces and nephews. So when I see my nieces and nephews on Facebook doing great stuff or being ornery, or I get to talk to my niece and nephew on text or the phone even sometimes, imagine that, that lifts me. So community is what is fulfilling to me and really strengthens my faith, and reminds me that the Creator has called me to something bigger.
How about you, Lenny?
I haven't been high on hope lately, or a lot of fuel for my faith. I'll leave you with some words that I gave that were published earlier today that I said, and I just, American Christianity needs a revival. I mean, it's mostly a whitewashed tomb with the ghost of Christianity haunting our churches. It's a group of people who get together and like to think how they used to take down empires with the power of God and make sure marginalized are centered and offer salvation, mercy, and grace. We tell stories of people who did those things, but we hardly ever do those things ourselves. We need to acknowledge that a large portion of the American Christian world will never commit to the task of dismantling white supremacy. And where I find hope, in answer to your question, Megan, is that the rest of us have to start this work with or without them, because the entire republic is on the line. And beyond the republic, perhaps the world and ourselves. The church is a spiritual body beyond time and space that has lasted 2,000 years and has watched the rise and fall of empires. We will survive this empire. We will also be held accountable for the actions we took as it fell.
Yes, that was a good set it down moment. I love it. I know that from the comments that I've been reading throughout this town hall that you all in your speaking and you're just being human beings, being embodied parts of God in this world have really fueled the faith of a lot of people. There's a lot of lovely comments out there if you want to check them out later. Vance has agreed to close us out with some faithful words, or would you be willing to conclude us, Vance?
Absolutely. And I'm going to smudge us, and I'll say a quick prayer for us after naming the community. But I just want to say also, as I prepare this sage, when you sage to close us out, to kind of purify us again and send us out. And then after we're gone, I'll light some cedar to call the good spirits to us. But I want to say that oftentimes we forget, and Lenny, do not take this. I've got it written down and it's sent to me in an email. These are my words. But we all forget as Christians that Jesus was tribal. Jesus was indigenous. Jesus spoke his tribal language. And the way in which Jesus interacted with his community was from that perspective and from that lens. And so everything that we learn from the Word, where Jesus is spoken of, and where and the lessons that Jesus teaches is about the circle, the healing of the hoop, the sacred hoop, the healing of the circle of people, the circle of the createds, our neighbors, our non-human siblings out who provide for us. Everything is from that lens. And so I just find it a little odd that we don't live more like indigenous people still today. There are obviously a couple thousand years of getting in the way of that, but an opportunity is there to remember that Jesus was meaning to and did, through his death and resurrection, healed the circle. We have since again separated it. And so we have to now do extra work to do better for the sake of our response to God's goodness and grace. So let us just remember that as we move on from this place, wherever we might be, those indigenous lands that we're on. And I will say a little prayer here. Creator, Vance, Drew, Manda, Bea, Lenny, Megan, Karen, area code 510, Amanda, Anita, Cindy, Cynthia, Doris, James, Jean, Jennifer, Karen, Kathy, Kristen, Mark, Mary, Mindy, Nathan, Pamela, Susan, and Trevor. Creator, we come to you in this day to give thanks for the opportunity for the community and the village that's gathered here. The community and village that has come together because we know that we need to continue to learn from one another and to grow with one another, to continue our work to mend the circle, that beautiful circle of peoples that make up our communities and make up our church. Be with us as we depart from this place, as we continue to journey together to do what is right, what is good, what is kind, what is loving, what is just. Be with all those who are in need of your special care today. Especially pray for Black people in our world. Might our world heal so that they can heal, that they might see justice and freedom in ways that are altogether surprising and new. Necessary, Creator, for all the rest of us also to understand love more fully. We give you thanks for the leaders of the Black Lives Movement Matter and all those who stand in solidarity, Black and otherwise. Be with us in our protests, be with us in our prayers, be with us in our worship, be with us in our speak to one another, that all of our tongues may burn with justice when opening our mouth. Thank you for our non-human siblings out in the world to provide everything that we need for a living. Might we continue to humble ourselves to understand that and to help mend their existence as well. Thank you again, Creator. We are so grateful for this time, for this medicine, and for this speak of justice. We beg you for this justice. All these things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a safe time, except for the times when you need to get a little dangerous to get